In this video, we're going to look at the reflexives of Latin. We're going to look at the word se, the reflexive pronoun, and we're going to look at the word suus, suus, suum, which is the reflexive possessive adjective. All this is covered in the grammar for 3B on page 160. Let's start by talking about reflexive pronouns. Reflexive pronouns in English end in self or selves. They exist in all three persons in both numbers. First person singular is myself, second person singular is yourself, third person singular is himself, herself, or itself, first person plural is ourselves, second person plural is yourselves, and third person plural is themselves. Reflexive means bending back. Flex, of course, means bending, like flex your arm, and means back. So reflexive means bending back. They are called reflexive pronouns because they indicate that the action of a verb has bent back to affect the subject of a sentence. For instance, if you say, I love myself, the action of the verb is bending back to affect the subject. That's what myself tells you. Similarly, if you say, the girls hurt themselves, themselves tells us that the action of the verb is bending back to affect the subject of the sentence. That's why we call these self pronouns reflexive. In Latin, the reflexive pronouns look like the normal personal pronouns in the first and second person singular and plural. You'll see them down here. I'm using accusative forms of the pronouns here because logically we'll discover reflexives cannot exist in the nominative. But these forms, me, te, nos, and vos, are the forms of the personal pronouns for the first and second person singular and plural that you learned long ago. So Latin uses the same words for the personal pronouns and for the reflexive pronouns in these forms. In the third person singular and plural, however, Latin's reflexive pronoun is se. So Latin has one reflexive pronoun, se, which is used in the third person singular and therefore means himself, herself, and itself, and in the plural, which when it's plural means themselves. Let's look at some examples. If you want to say I love myself in Latin, you merely say me amo. There's no special form to indicate that this is reflexive. We just use the same pronoun as we learned long ago. You love yourself as te amas, but he loves himself as se amat. There is a special reflexive form here that means himself. It's the same form that you use for she too. She loves herself is se amat. Here's se. Se is masculine or feminine and neuter in the singular, so it can be himself, herself, or itself. In the plural, first person, we love ourselves as amamos, we love nos, ourselves. And again, this is the same form as we learned long ago for the accusative of the word that means we. And y'all love yourselves as vos amatus. Again, vos is the plural accusative form of the reflexive, and it looks just like the y'all form we learned long ago for the accusative. They love themselves, however, in the third person is se amat. There is a special form for the third person plural reflexive se, and it's the same as the singular up here. Let's talk about the declension of se. Se declines just like tu. You may remember that tu went tu, te, tui, tibi, te. This is nominative, tu is nominative, te is accusative, tui is genitive, tibi is dative, and te is ablative. So tu, te, tui, tibi, te. Now logically, when you think about it, a reflexive pronoun cannot have a nominative form. Why? Because it refers back to the subject, and it doesn't make sense to have a subject to refer back to itself. That just doesn't make sense. So there is no nominative form of the reflexive pronoun. But from that point on, in the accusative, genitive, dative, and ablative, it looks exactly like tu. So it's se, sui, sibi, se. Se, sui, sibi, se. Accusative, genitive, dative, and ablative. So that is Latin's reflexive pronoun se. We now have to talk about Latin's reflexive possessive adjective, suus, sua, suum. Before we do that, let's go back and review possessives for a moment. Latin's personal pronouns have possessive adjectives associated with them. For instance, ego, which means I, has the adjectives meus, mea, meum associated with it. Tu has tuus, tua, tuum. Nos has noster, nostra, nostrum. Vos has wester, westra, westrum. But remember, There is no third-person pronoun. Remember, Latin doesn't really have a way to say he, she, it, or they in a direct fashion. And not surprisingly, therefore, there is actually no possessive adjective that means his, her, its, or their. Instead, Romans use the genitive of is, id. Eius in the singular, eorum or earum in the plural. Eorum is masculine and neuter, earum is feminine. So, eius is used to mean his, her, or its, but it really isn't literally his, her, or its. It really means something like of that guy I just mentioned. So if you want to say his hat in Latin, you have to say the hat of that guy I just mentioned, eius, right? And in the plural, it's eorum and earum, which means their. So if you want to say their cars, you have to say the cars eorum, the cars of those guys I just mentioned. Now, possessive adjectives, that is meas, mea, meum, tuus, tua, tuum, noster, nostra, nostrum, and wester, westra, westrum, have to agree in gender, case, and number with what they describe. Here's an example. This means I saw your stylus. Remember a stylus, the word is stylus, stili, masculine. A stylus is a sort of little pen-like instrument with which you scratch on a wax tablet to write, on tabelas to write. So, I saw your stylus. Stilum here is accusative masculine singular, and that means that tuus has to be accusative masculine singular. It has to agree in gender, number, and case with stilus. But if I want to say your stylus is in the house, now stilus is a subject, so it's nominative masculine singular, and tuus has to agree with it. Stilus tuus. So the forms of tuus agree in gender, number, and case with what they describe. However, because the words for his, her, and their are not possessive adjectives in Latin, they never change to agree in gender, case, and number. Let's say I want to say, I saw his stylus. I would say, stilum eius vidi. I saw his stylus. But eius here is not agreeing in gender, number, and case with stilus, or stilum in this case, because it's not a possessive adjective. It's just a genitive. This literally means, I saw the stylus of that guy I just mentioned. That means that, for instance, when stilus becomes a nominative, as in this sentence, stilus eius est in idibus, his stylus is in the house, eius has the exact same form. It never changes. It is not agreeing in gender, number, and case with stilus. What this literally means is the stylus of that guy I just mentioned is in the house. So when you use the forms of is and id to indicate he or her, or should I say his, her, its, and their, they do not change form. The reflexive pronoun, however, does have a possessive adjective. It is suus, sua, suum, and it must agree with what it describes. This sentence means Marcus saw his father. Marcus videt suum patrem. Marcus saw his father. Suum means his here. Suum patrem means his father. And suum is accusative masculine singular and must agree with patrem, which is accusative masculine singular. We use suis here because the his here is referring back to Marcus. This is Marcus's father we're talking about. So Marcus saw his father, or maybe Marcus saw his own father, is Marcus suum patrem videt. Similarly, if we want to say Julia saw her sisters, and we mean the sisters are the sisters of Julia, not of someone else, we have to say Julia suas sorores videt. Julia saw her sisters. And the word for her, suis, is reflexive because it's referring back to Julia, and it has to agree in gender, number, and case with sorores because it's an adjective describing sorores, and therefore it must be feminine plural, like sorores is feminine plural. Here's an important point, however. In Latin, you must distinguish between the reflexive possessive and the genitive forms of eius, eorum, earum. This is what I mean. If I say Marcus patrem suum videt, this means Marcus saw his father. The suis tells us that the his here must refer to Marcus. In other words, this can't be anyone else's father. Marcus patrem suum videt means Marcus saw his father, or his own father, you might say. On the other hand, if I say Marcus patrem eius videt, this is not the reflexive. And in Latin, that means that this cannot be Marcus's father that Marcus saw. This eius of that guy I just mentioned has to be someone other than Marcus. If this were Marcus's father, we would have to use suum. So Marcus patrem vidit, or Marcus patrem eius vidit means Marcus saw his father, but the his cannot be Marcus. Let me go into this a little bit more deeply. In English, this statement is ambiguous. If I say John saw his father, the question arises, is his father John's father or someone else's? It's not clear in English. To distinguish, we can say something that John saw his own father if we want to distinguish that it's clear John's. But in English, when we use his, it's not clear. In Latin, you must distinguish between the reflexive possessive and eius eorum earum. Marcus patrem suum vidit means Marcus saw his father, and it must be Marcus's father, in other words, his own father. Marcus patrem eius vidit means Marcus saw his father, but it can't be Marcus's father. It has to be someone else's father, like Bill or Mark or Tom.
The end. This has been a Barking Blue Heeler production.